Awesome. It is 12 o'clock, so I guess we'll begin. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. I'm Trey Goodson, Director of Marketing and Communications for NC East Alliance. We have a great presentation from Laura Ullrich, Senior Regional Economist for the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond today. She's going to dive into some national economic indicators, some regional and some local ones as well. She always does a great job, so we're very excited to have her today. But first, as always, I'd like to thank a few of our sponsors that help make these webinars happen. So our platinum sponsors are ECU, Integrated Financial Holdings, Kilpatrick Townsend, ECU Health, and KTS Strategies. Our gold sponsors are Bull & Company Media Works, Dominion Energy. Our silver sponsors are Edenton Chowan Partnership, Evolve, Martin County Economic Development, Martin Marietta, Nutrien, PNC Bank, and the Port of Virginia. And our friends of NC East Alliance are John Chafee of Transworld Business Advisors of Eastern North Carolina and Tony Corey of Transworld Business Advisors of Eastern North Carolina. And I also do want to thank the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond for their partnership over the past few years. We had President Tom Barkin visit Eastern North Carolina. He discussed rural economics with some of our communities in the region. I think there's a report on the Federal Reserve website, and also I believe there's an interview as well. I'll share some of that information in the follow-up email with this recording. And the last thing I'll mention is the Q&A box will be available for your questions throughout the presentation, so you can go ahead and plug it in as they come to mind, but we'll also address them at the end of the presentation as well. And so now, I'll turn it over to the star of the show, who is fresh off a TV interview. Laura, it's all you.
Thanks so much, Trey. So happy to be here again this year. Always glad to interact with you guys. It's always a great group. As Trey mentioned, the Q&A box will be open, so feel free to type in questions as I go. I'll address them in real time if they're relevant to the slide I'm showing. If not, we'll save them for the end, but definitely want to be able to answer whatever questions you have. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we will jump right in. Okay, so I always get to remind people, since I work for the Federal Reserve, that the views I'm going to express are mine alone and don't represent an official position of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. And I'll start off talking about kind of where we are now. This has been, I joined the Fed almost 4 years ago, and the past 3 years have just been a really wild ride, right? COVID itself, the initial shutdown, and then since then, basically the recovery from that too, right? And recovery from supply chain issues and what's going on in Russia and Ukraine and all sorts of other things that have kind of speed bumps that have popped up along the way. But if I look back at 2021 and 2022, 2021 was really an incredible year of economic growth. And I'll show you data that will support all of this. 2022 has been a little bumpier. We started out with 2 negative quarters of GDP growth in Q1 and Q2. But Q3 growth was actually considerably higher than expected. And actually the revisions just came in. It was revised up even higher. And so, by the end of the year, it looks like when all the dust settles, we will be up a bit in terms of economic growth for the year. So all in all, not a terrible year, but some sectors continue to be hit harder than others. So you talk to businesses in some sectors and they're still going gangbusters and everything's great. You talk to somebody that's in residential real estate right now, and they've seen in some ways a collapse of the business they were having earlier in the year. There's still certainly fears of recession out there. I was reading a Wall Street Journal poll this morning that was showing that people are kind of negative overall about the economy going into 2023. And I can understand why, right? We've been in a period of high inflation. People are concerned about the economy. But really, if you look at what's been going on in terms of employment, so GDP was negative those first 2 quarters and then has kind of recovered. Employment has remained quite strong. And North Carolina is kind of leading the way in that regard. And I'll show you these data, but employment growth in North Carolina has really been very high overall. Now, it's important to acknowledge that that is not true universally, right? Some of you are in counties that have had long-term economic and population declines, employment and population declines. And in some places that has worsened. But overall, North Carolina has done very well. Inflation still remains well above the 2% target. And the Fed has been rather aggressive with interest rate hikes and have communicated pretty clearly that they intend to continue raising rates until they feel like inflation is going to certainly return back to the 2% target. So if we start with GDP growth, this chart does a great job showing just how chaotic 2020 was, right? This was unlike anything we've ever seen before. It's the largest one-quarter decline in real GDP and the largest one-quarter increase in real GDP in modern U.S. history since we've been tracking it. And so, like I said, you can see last year, GDP growth was pretty strong. 2021 was a year of strong growth. And then we did have these 2 negative quarters of GDP growth. Now, I need everybody on this webinar to help me remind people that this is not the definition of a recession. 2 negative quarters of GDP growth. A lot of people think that's the definition of recession. It is not. Instead, there's a committee of economists that decide when we're in a recession. They date the recession, and they look at a lot of different indicators. And so we're not in a called recession at this point. On the far right, you'll see FOMC projections. The FOMC is the Federal Open Markets Committee. So this is the group that meets and votes about interest rates and other monetary policy. They do projections every other meeting of what they think is going to happen in the economy over the next few years. You'll see these later on too in terms of interest rates. And you can see that they're expecting kind of flat growth for 2022 and then kind of a return to somewhere normal around 2% annual growth going forward. It's always good to remind folks that economic growth, how do you grow an economy? Because GDP is the total value of all final goods and services in an economy. Real GDP, it controls for inflation. So how do we make more stuff? How do we grow GDP? Well, essentially, we either become more productive, right, where we can make more things per hour with the same amount of labor or same number of inputs, or we grow the population somehow. We grow our labor, or a little bit of both. Because population growth is so low in the U.S., it's hard for us to have economic growth that's well above 2% at this point in time as an economy. And so these estimates might seem kind of low, but they're kind of a pretty normal, I would say. And if we look at what's driving GDP doing pretty well, it really is consumption. So consumption is about 70% of GDP. And so sometimes you'll hear people say, so goes consumption, so goes the economy. There's some truth there because it makes up such a big portion of GDP. And one of the things you'll notice here is that during COVID, spending on services was hit much more than spending on goods. And spending on goods bounced back quickly and then went way above where it had been before. This is where some of the inflation is coming from. So people couldn't spend money in the same ways they did before. Some services were unavailable, right? And in the beginning of COVID, you might not be able to go out to eat at the same restaurants you would normally want to go out to eat at. You might not be able to go travel like you planned on doing, things like that. So instead, people bought goods. They said, okay, we can't go on that European trip we were going to go on, so we're going to buy an RV and drive it across the country, or we're going to buy a kayak and take it out on the lake. And so we saw that demand for certain goods and services really went through the roof. So recreational goods, like I said, also home goods, people trapped in their houses and realized like, oh, my couch is really uncomfortable. I'm going to buy a new couch, right? So demand for many of these products was very high. Goods spending remains elevated at this point. Services spending is a very different story. So it got hit hard and it took quite a while to recover. And actually just in the last month, we recovered in October, we recovered services spending to where it was pre-COVID. So currently there are some industries that have been hit really hard by the interest rate increases and or other things like supply chain issues or decreases in demand. And housing is the industry that's been really hit the hardest. It's very interest rate sensitive, right? Mortgage rates are up. People are buying less homes. People who have low interest rate mortgages, like many of us got pre-COVID or during COVID a couple of years ago, we don't want to move, right? Because we've got low interest rates, and so we're not going to sell our house. So the supply of housing available is low as well. And so we've seen an incredible decline in house sales. And really, if you look at the decline we've seen very recently, it is even steeper of a decline than we saw with the Great Recession. And we're seeing a similar thing with single family starts and permits. So nationally, single family starts and permits are down as well. Now, the dotted line you see there on that upper right-hand graph, that is the 1990s average for housing starts. And we put that on there to show you that after the Great Recession, we fell to well below the average of starts and permits, so new homes being built, than we saw in the 1990s. And it took us until COVID to get above that level, and now we've fallen below it again. This is important because in many metro areas around the country, we are not building enough homes to keep up with immigration and population growth, which of course is just increasing the prices of housing even more. There's a question that asks, are these national trends? Yes, for right now, these are national trends. I'll do regional stuff in a second, but this is national. On the flip side, though, manufacturing is doing quite well. If you look at new orders, they remain very high compared to kind of a pre-COVID norm. And the utilization rate of manufacturing capacity, so what percentage of capacity is being used, is also very high right now. So manufacturers are making stuff, they're operating at a relatively high capacity, and they're continuing to get good orders. I will tell you, a big part of our job here as economists that work in outreach is to go out and talk to companies about what they're experiencing. Many of the companies we talk to say things like, we keep expecting demand to decline, but we haven't seen it yet. Or we think demand will decline next year, but 2022 has been a great year for us. Some others we talked to might have seen some decline in demand already, but it's still well above where it was in 2019 as kind of like a pre-COVID comparison. So some industries doing well, some really hurting. In terms of employment, nationally, we are now back above where we were before COVID. So if you look at what happened in March and April of 2020, it is hard to overstate the just shock and awe of losing this many jobs. It's just like this, right? I mean, we lost about 14% of the jobs nationally, just disappeared in March and April 2020. And it took a while to get back to pre-COVID levels. We just got back to pre-COVID levels, I think back in September, nationally. So you will notice, though, on this graph that we haven't gotten back to the same place we would have probably been if COVID had never happened, right? So if I kept drawing the line from February 2020, we're still below where we probably would have been. But I'll point out that month over month, we are still adding way more jobs than we would expect to in kind of a flat economy. So we need to add about 80 to 100,000 jobs a month to keep up with normal labor market churn. So to keep up with population growth, to keep up with people retiring, passing away, those sorts of things. So we've been adding at least 250,000 jobs a month, like month over month over month, which is well above 80 to 100,000 jobs, right? So this is considered quite expansionary. If I'm being honest, as an economist, I'm a little surprised that it's remained as strong as it has, but we just continue to see really impressive job growth. And that is no exception in North Carolina. As a matter of fact, in our district, so the 5th district of the Federal Reserve includes the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia, and DC. So I have all those geographies here. And what this graph does is it indexes employment to 100 in February 2020 so that we can see, okay, what percentage of jobs were lost in the economy, and then how many have we added back. And you'll see North Carolina is that top orange line. It is far outperforming the other states in our district. And as I just mentioned, we didn't get back to pre-COVID levels of employment nationally until September 2022. We're still not back in Maryland, West Virginia, or DC. But North Carolina had recovered back to pre-COVID levels of employment back in June 2021. So North Carolina had a faster recovery and much stronger recovery. As of right now, the state of North Carolina has more than 200,000 jobs more than existed in the state before COVID. But, and there's several caveats, several buts here, that doesn't mean this is the case everywhere. So Raleigh has been growing like wildfire. So this looks at February 2020 to October 2022. So what was the employment growth? And these are all the MSAs in North Carolina, and you'll see the US and North Carolina average on there as well. So North Carolina has grown by 4.5%, which nationally is very high. This is one of the strongest in the country. And you can see that most MSAs in North Carolina have had pretty strong employment growth during that time. However, there are 3 exceptions to that, and they're all in Eastern North Carolina, right? So New Bern, New Bern, Greenville, Goldsboro, and Rocky Mount have seen job decline as compared to pre-COVID. And Rocky Mount, you can see, is 3.2%. So Rocky Mount has shrunk almost as much as Wilmington has grown, right, as a percentage. So that is not an insignificant decline. So these, different communities are experiencing growth differently. I'll also point out that you can also have 2 communities that are growing well, that have a lot of employment growth, but the growth feels different. So I'm the regional economist for North and South Carolina, so I get out across the Carolinas all the time. The growth in Raleigh and Charlotte feel very different. They're both growing rapidly, but the industries they're growing in are quite different. So in Raleigh, it's much more life sciences, biotech, IT. Charlotte is more advanced manufacturing, financial services. The Raleigh jobs tend to pay more, so they're having more kind of like high-end development in retail, multifamily, single family than you see in Charlotte. So even places that are both growing, that growth can feel really different. This is one of my favorite graphs to show people. So this has all the MSAs in North and South Carolina. Each bubble is an MSA, Metropolitan Statistical Area. The bigger the bubble, the bigger the MSA. So you'll see Charlotte's the biggest one on there, followed by Raleigh. And we have 1-year employment growth on the x-axis and 10-year employment growth on the y-axis to see, okay, so maybe a community has one bad year, but what does it look like from a 10-year period? And of course, this includes the COVID time period. So a community really wants to be kind of in the far upper right-hand corner. And you can see the blue bubble up there for some reason is missing its label, but Raleigh, Charlotte, and Charleston, South Carolina are pretty significant outliers across the Carolinas in terms of employment growth, both in the short term and the long term. And then you can see Greenville, Anderson, Malden is doing quite well in the short term as well. I will say that there's only 2 MSAs in the Carolinas that have negative employment growth over a 10-year period. That's Goldsboro and Rocky Mount. And then there's only 1, Rocky Mount, that have both short-term and long-term employment declines. If I were to put other states on here, so if I were to put Illinois, Ohio, California, you would see a much different picture. You would still see some that have grown really well. Columbus, Ohio has grown really well, but there would be more MSAs that are in that bottom left-hand quadrant that have seen short-term and long-term employment declines. Why is this important? This is important because when employment and population are declining, so is the tax base, right? And so it's hard to provide the same level of services. It's hard to maintain the level of public education, other public services available in the economy. It just becomes more of a struggle. You also can end up with dilapidated buildings in areas that are really in decline. And so communities don't want to be in that bottom left-hand quadrant, and happy to talk more about that as we go along. If we go drill down into your footprint in Eastern North Carolina, wanted to show, so somebody's asking what MSA stands for. It's Metropolitan Statistical Area. So you're not in a metro, if you're a small rural county, you're likely not in a metropolitan statistical area. So the metropolitan statistical areas are the county, the metro county itself, so like in Raleigh, Wake County, and then the counties around it. And it's based on commute times and commuting patterns. So some MSAs are bigger than others. There's no like set defined area. So if we drill down in a bit more, I wanted to show you the percent of jobs that were lost during COVID and then what the recovery has looked like. So during COVID, the most significant losses in Eastern North Carolina were in Wayne and Pitt counties. And you can see some counties, so Hyde County, Lenore County, didn't lose as many jobs. But still, everybody lost at least 2% during COVID. But if you look at the recovery, one of the things that's interesting, so I want you to look, for example, at Northampton County as an example. Northampton was kind of middle of the road in terms of employment loss during COVID, so lost between 9.5% and 14.4% in employment. But in terms of recovery, it's been one of the lowest. So Northampton County is not above 100% yet. You know, I showed you as a whole, North Carolina is well above 100%. And if you look at Dare County, if you look at Onslow County, if you look at some of the ones that are in the dark blue, they're above 100% now, but those that are in the lighter colors are still below 100%. So let me back up a little bit and acknowledge that this is a little bit of a confusing story right now, because I'm telling you that in most places in North Carolina, we now have more jobs than we had before COVID. And I'm telling you, from a state perspective and a national perspective, we have more jobs than we had before COVID. So a lot of times I get asked the question, actually the number one question I get asked right now in presentations is, where are all the workers? Where are the workers? Why do we have these labor shortages? And the answer to that question is largely unsatisfying to people, because the answer is they're working. There are people who have left the labor force, mainly people over age 65. I'm going to show you that data in just a second. But many workers most everybody's back working. The difference is people have changed how they work, who they work for, and where they work. And you can see this in the industry-specific data. So if we look by sector, and actually new data for November came out this morning, just a little while ago. So this just goes through October. But yeah, we're down 14,300 jobs in North Carolina in the government sector. These are mostly state and local government jobs, so things like K-12 school teachers and social workers and things like that. We're down over 10,000 jobs in leisure and hospitality. So yes, you can still go to a McDonald's and see that the lobby is closed because they don't have enough workers, right? Or there are restaurants where you walk up and there's a sign on the door that says, please be patient with us, we have a labor shortage. But look at the bottom. We've added over 90,000 jobs in professional and business services since February 2020. We've added over 30,000 jobs in healthcare and social assistance and transportation, warehousing, and utilities. So people have shifted, right? It's not, I think sometimes people assume that if the people aren't working at McDonald's anymore, they're just not working. That's not actually what the data show. The data show they've shifted to other types of jobs. And one of the things I've been pointing out recently is that they have shifted to other sectors and other types of jobs. And just given the patterns you see here, they've moved from jobs where you would see them. So if somebody's working at McDonald's, you might see them, right? If somebody's working as a K-12 teacher, you might see them, to jobs where you do not see them. If somebody's working at a warehouse, you're not going to see them. If somebody's working for a bank call center from their home, you're not going to see them. And so we've seen this big shift in where people are working, and many more people are working kind of behind the scenes. If you look at what sectors have lost the most employment, there are common themes there. And it basically can be whittled down, in my opinion, to people have left jobs that are very difficult and very stressful that don't pay very much. So if you look in that healthcare and social assistance sector, that sector's done really well overall, but buried in there is a subsector that's done very poorly, which is nursing home employment. Those are really hard jobs, right? And so if somebody can leave working at the nursing home as a CNA or whatever and get a job for a bank and a call center, or work in an Amazon warehouse and make even more money than they made before, maybe, but even if they make the same money, it's a much less stressful work environment. It's not maybe that surprising that we've seen people make these shifts. And so this is going to, somebody's asking, do I think that the professional business services jobs increase due to the potential to work from home for those types of jobs? Some of them, absolutely. The surveys right now show that employees really above all else want flexibility. They want the ability to work from home some, and you can't do that as a McDonald's employee, right? You can't do that as a K-12 teacher in most cases, as a traditional K-12 teacher. So yes, I do think that is part of it. And large organizations, like really big businesses, a lot of them still have a lot of their employees either fully working from home or working from home. Like myself, I come in 2 days a week. So I have this hybrid schedule. And so I think there are a lot of people that have wanted to take advantage of that. So part of the conversation we have to have here is about labor force participation, because things do look pretty good from a GDP recovery point of view. Things do look really good, really, from an employment recovery. But labor force participation itself has not recovered. So labor force participation is the percentage of people, basically the percentage of adults that could be working, that are either working or looking for work. And I show this here all the way back to 1948 by design, because there was this huge increase in labor force participation between the mid-1960s and 2000, and really the 1990s. That was driven by two phenomena. Number one, women entering the labor force. So overall labor force participation rate went up by about 8 percentage points during that time period, but female labor force participation rate went up by 17 percentage points. The other thing was baby boomers becoming part of the workforce. So you had baby boomers moving from being a giant population of children to being a giant population of workers. One thing, people kind of know these narratives. That's not surprising to them. What people don't a lot of times know is that labor force participation rate has been falling since 2000. Part of this also is about the baby boomers. Part of this is about baby boomers beginning to retire. Part of this is about the graying of America. So people are living longer. And so if they're retiring still around, 62 to 65, then they have more of a period of time of retirement. But there are also things going on as well, such as prime age male labor force participation falling. So 25 to 54-year-old men, especially white men, labor force participation has been declining. So I wanted to show you guys some graphs on who left the labor force and who has not come back yet, because this is really important, because some economists, including myself, do not expect this to get any better due to demographic shifts. And so I think it's important to look at a little closer. So this is labor force participation rates for different age groups and different education. So on the top left, we have age 25 to 54-year-olds. This is called prime age. So prime age is like, after you ought to be out of school probably and before you're old enough to retire. That rate, if you look between, it has been falling a bit for a while. If you look between about 2015 and 2020, that increase was driven by older people working a little bit longer, and also African-American male labor force participation rate had improved. I'll come back to that in a minute. If you look at age 55 plus, well, let's go back to prime age. The vast majority of workers are prime age because they are prime age, right? They're right in the thick of when they need to be working. And so even though if you look at, as a percentage, it's recovered pretty well, but that gap is a lot of workers that are missing, if that makes sense. But age 55 plus and really age 65 plus is where we see the biggest decline. The St. Louis Fed estimates that approximately 2.5 million extra people retired in 2020 and 2021. This was driven by several things. This was driven by people just going home and taking stock of their lives, like what am I going to do going forward, and saying, you know what, it's time for me to retire. Secondly, stock portfolios did well during that time, so people had more money. And then thirdly, there was a major shift in technology, and that I think led to some people deciding they would rather retire than shift to the new technology at their work. One story that's interesting is for people without a high school diploma. So in general, these are the lowest wage individuals. Their labor force participation rate has long been the worst, right? So if you stratify this by education, those without a high school degree have the lowest labor force participation rate, partially because they make their lowest wages, right? Their opportunity cost of not working is lower. But it hasn't changed much over time. So it just kind of, it's low, it's not good, but it's kind of like predictably not good over time. Where we've seen big changes is in college grad and in high school grad, no college. The high school grad, no college group is actually where a lot of the white males that have left the labor force in that prime age group reside. And a lot of what, if you read research, a lot of this shift has been blamed on kind of the reduction of manufacturing opportunities, especially in the Midwest, from the auto manufacturing and other similar industries. And so the jobs that somebody used to be able to get with just a high school degree went away, and men did not, especially, adapt well to that reality. So you didn't see them saying, okay, well, the auto plant went away, but the hospital needs lots of nurses, so I'll go become a nurse, right? Or to kind of change what they were doing. And since COVID, we have not seen a good recovery at all in that high school grad, no college labor force participation rate. Now, I will pause here and say, the research on this, I do a lot of research on this topic. The research is extraordinarily depressing, because what you will read if you read the research is that this is a decline that's been going on for 20 plus years at this point. And there are a lot of economists that believe it is primarily driven by a few issues. Drug abuse, so opioid epidemic being the main thing there. The prevalence of criminal records, so the difficulty of finding a job if you have a criminal record. Video games, that sounds crazy, but there's a lot of research that show that these men who don't work, there's actually a research paper that's very good that shows that men, these young men that are not working, they're spending about 75% of their extra time that they have because they're not working, playing video games or other computer leisure. And then also disability and mental health. So these are not about COVID, right? This is not a COVID phenomenon. However, COVID exacerbated all that, right? So if you played too many video games before COVID, you definitely played too many during COVID, right? If you had mental health issues before, the isolation of COVID probably made that worse. If you were an opioid addict, like the opioid death rates have gone up every year recently. So that problem's getting worse. So we have some of these cultural things going on. Some of it is an aging demographic story. There's not much we can do about that because we know the baby boomers are going to retire, right? We know we can calculate that, but the prime age men not working is much more considering. So somebody asked a great question. I hear you about young men not working and why, but how are they supporting themselves and their families, or are they not? Great question. One of the things, and I actually read an article about that this morning, and I may even still have it up on my computer. I'm going to pull it up to see, but to tell you the exact number. But what we're seeing is we're seeing a pretty significant percentage of adults living with their parents still. So the percentage of men, I believe the most recent number is 19% of age 25 to 34-year-old men live with their parents. And a reasonable percentage of those people that live with their parents do not work. I call this extended adolescence because it's a nice way of saying it. But I think a lot of what we are seeing, especially with men, I think the same percentage for women is 12%, is that there's a longer period of time where they are being supported by their parents or grandparents or someone else. And it has to be that really because men do not qualify for many of the government benefits unless they're a single dad, which that's not what's going on in many of these cases. So they're not going to be able to qualify for Medicaid or TANF, not in North Carolina anyway. So it really has to be that they're getting support from somewhere else, or maybe a woman, right? Maybe they have a girlfriend or a wife that are working and they're not. But in many cases, it is that they're being supported by parents. What we're seeing is that people are having children later, right? Like the average age of first child being born for a man is now over age 30. And so they're not necessarily supporting a family. They're just by themselves and live with their parents and maybe work a little bit, maybe not. But from an economic point of view, this is really concerning because that means we're missing significant numbers of workers. And so when I say this, sometimes when I'm in person, and some of y'all right now are probably rolling your eyes at me where you are, but sometimes I'll see people look at me like, I don't think that's true. And then I'll say like, I know there's people in this audience that are paying the cell phone bill of a 25-year-old or a 30-year-old right now. Like this is happening. And so we do have this longer period of time where people are being supported. I will always say, and it's true, I have 3 teenage boys. They hate that I do this research because I expect them to have jobs when they're 15 and get out and work because I'm so concerned about them being productive. But it is a really concerning trend in my opinion. And so if we dig into the percentage change in labor force participation rates, so Black men, if you look at this for ages 20 to 24, so I have it separated out by gender and by race. Black male labor force participation rates are actually up, and you see that in every age group for Black men. And actually, right now, we have the smallest gap ever between white male and Black male labor force participation rates. And so even age 65 plus, there's been an increase in the Black male labor force participation rates. But you'll see there that the other racial and gender categories are down for age 2024, and kind of a similar story for prime age. But you see there, I mean, you got 206,000 white males prime age that are out of the labor force compared to November 2019. I did November 2019 because these are not seasonally adjusted, so I wanted to compare November to November. White women down 489,000. Now, somebody asked, do you think increased cost of childcare is having a negative impact on participation? Absolutely. You can see it right there, right? You know, there'll be research that will come out that will show exactly by how much, but I think it's pretty obvious that it absolutely is having a negative impact on participation. I also think, just from what I hear when I'm out and about talking to people and talking to groups like yourself, I think it's not only having a negative impact on the labor force participation of younger people, but I think there's a lot of grandparents that are taking care of children too during the day because parents can't afford childcare. It's really gotten to be just astronomical. But you'll see, if you look at percentages, you'll see white male labor force participation for those over age 65 is down 8.6% compared to pre-COVID, and white women is down over 7%. Those folks are very unlikely to come back into the labor force. If they're over age 65, most of them have turned on their Social Security. They have Medicare now, right? They might have some pension income or annuity income. They are not very likely to come back into the labor force. If you're familiar with the Social Security rules, Social Security puts a pretty tremendous tax on labor income. You basically have to turn it back off if you're making above, I think it's $18,000 a year, but anyway, some low amount a year. And so it's unlikely they will come back. So I think the more interesting conversation is, why are prime age people leaving? I think for women, it is a lot of it is a childcare story. I think for men, most of it, in my opinion, is a story about these other things and cultural shifts that we're just seeing. Men are not younger men, and these are typically high school degree, no college men, are just not faring very well economically right now. There's a great book called Of Boys and Men. It's a brand new book that just came out, written by an economist, Richard Reeves, at Brookings Institute. I highly recommend it. It gives you lots of statistics about this, about how boys are falling behind really significantly in education and in the workforce. And like I said, the reason I'm so obsessed with this topic is because I have 3 boys myself, and I find it very interesting. And also, as a professor for 17 years, and as a professor, I was seeing these trends. I was seeing all of a sudden there were fewer boys in my classes, and they weren't performing as well as many of the female students. And so I think it's an important conversation for us to have. I do think there are solutions here. I think there are ways we can engage people that want to work but are on the sidelines, right? So we might not be able to reach the people that retired and don't want to come back to work, but there's also people that maybe have a criminal background who would love to come have a job, but it's just very difficult for them to get one, right? Or a mom that would love to work, but, you know, I had a colleague just yesterday, he just had a child, and he told me that infant care is going to be $1,700 a month. It's just astronomical. And so certainly if you have 2 or more children that are childcare age, you'd have to make a really solid income, much higher than median state income, to justify that. Somebody asked about what is the percentage of prime age men not working. I do know that I could look up these exact amounts, but I don't want to do it while I'm in the presentation. However, I do know that in 1980, 95% of prime age males worked. 95% were in the labor force, so either worked or were looking for work. In 2019, that was 89%. So it's just 6 percentage points, but that's 3 million workers. It's 3 million workers that have been lost. And unfortunately, I think with some, and we see this every day, right? We're seeing it with crime statistics. We're seeing it all over the place, that there are kind of increasingly larger numbers of kind of disaffected young men. So I think for communities, for any of you that work in that space or work in HR, I do think there's ways to try to engage populations, and certainly those who are in higher ed and other areas of education have seen this too. But somebody asked, what do I think is driving the college grad decline? Some of that is the graying of America. College grads tend to live longer, and so people that have graduated and who graduate from college have longer periods of retirement. So some of that decline is from, it's probably a significant part of that decline is from the graying of America. I do wonder too, is childcare impacting that? Jason McCloud asked a great question, which I do get asked sometimes. Did the Affordable Care Act requirement for coverage until age 26 contribute to these people staying home with parents? I think it does contribute at some level. I'm not familiar with the research, like the economic research on the topic, but it does make sense that if you don't need to get a job for benefits, maybe you're not as eager to kind of grow up and get out of the house. I honestly think, though, that the biggest thing here is it's a cultural shift. When I graduated from college, I didn't know anybody that moved home. And if one of my friends had been moving home, we would have thought that was so strange. And now it's just considered the norm. And so I personally, as an economist, that much of it is just about signaling. If you allow your 22-year-old to move home after they finish college, then you're saying that you support them in doing that, right? You support them living at home as educated adults. Actually, in the article I was reading this morning, they were saying there's some research that shows that even the most well-meaning parents, when they let their kids move home, you know, maybe it's for all the right reasons, right? She wants to save money to buy a house. She wants to be able to pay off her student loans, all these things that are the right reasons, that when the adult child moves home, the parent and the child regress. They both fall backwards. And so I think most of this is cultural. And I don't know what changes it, but I do think that it changes the viewpoint. You know, I've got a college age son now. And when I was in college, and I know probably a lot of y'all listening here, you were like me. I mean, I graduated college at 22. I got married at 23. I had a baby at 25. And so when I graduated college, I was eager to figure out, like, how can I buy a home? How can I, you know, what am I going to do when I get married? What job can I have? Now, if people don't anticipate that they'll start a family until they're in their 30s, it's hard to convince a 19-year-old boy, I can tell you for sure, in my house, it's hard to convince a 19-year-old boy that they should be anxious about these sorts of things. You know what I'm saying? You need to try to get an internship. You need to think about, you know, are you dating? Or, you know, whatever it is, it's hard to get them to feel motivated to do some of those things if they don't feel like adolescence ends until into your 30s. So I think it's a really interesting thing. And I highly recommend that book. Someone asked, how does immigration factor into this conversation? Very importantly. So our president has been giving out a fact that I'm not exactly sure the source of it, but I know they triple and quadruple check his facts, that about 1.5 million fewer immigrants are working in the U.S. than we would have seen if not for COVID. Immigration policy is extraordinarily tight. The Trump administration made it very tight, and the Biden administration has not loosened up. And so it is very difficult to get workers. And this is on both ends of the hiring spectrum. This is at the lowest level of wages. So people cleaning hotel rooms, people working in agriculture, and then it also is really impacting life sciences, biosciences, where they need engineering, where they need people with graduate degrees, because we tend to import a lot of those folks, and that just hasn't been happening. So what we've seen because of this tightness in the labor market is that wages are up. We've also seen the job openings rate be very high. That has come down quite a bit, but it's still way higher than what would be normal. But we are seeing the hires rate and the quits rate start to go down. So what does that mean? That means people are not as confident about quitting their job now as they were before, right? Maybe they're thinking, oh, we might go into a recession, things are slowing down. I don't want to start a new job because maybe it's last in, first out type thing. But still, when we're out talking to businesses, we talk to a lot of businesses that are slowing down their pace of hiring, but not stopping, because they still haven't been able to be fully staffed this entire time. We're seeing in our own surveys, this is from our survey, that it's easier to find people with the skills unique now than it was a few months ago, but still some issues there. And so we have seen wages go up. So one thing that's interesting here is that normally, if you look back to like 2011, 12, 13, 14, typically high skilled jobs, so jobs that require a bachelor's degree or higher, have wage rates that grow faster than low skill jobs. But that's not what we're seeing right now. The lower skill jobs, that's where a lot of these labor shortages exist. Remember, I said some of the declines we're seeing are amongst people that just have a high school degree, right? No higher ed. And so these low skill jobs that they could fill, labor supply is constrained, and so they're having to offer higher wages. I will point out, though, that these wages are lower than inflation. And so for most people, they've seen negative real wage growth, which means you feel poor, right? You can buy less stuff than you could buy a year ago. We are seeing some raise of hope with inflation. So the past couple of announcements have been good. So this is personal consumption, core personal consumption expenditures. This is the key rate that the Fed looks at. And it has come down a bit, and you'll see the projections of the FOMC there that they predicted to come back down. Our target is 2%, and they're saying, maybe 2025 we get there. This is CPI. So this is the inflation index that you hear reported more in the news. These numbers came out just this week. And this shows both what we call headline or all goods CPI and core CPI. Core CPI and PCE, that means you take out energy, you take out food prices. The reason we look at core is because there's not a lot the Fed can do to impact energy prices or food prices. These are global commodity markets. And so monetary policy is not really going to affect that. So we want to look at overall CPI, but also core. Both were down this last month in the release that just came out this week, more than expected. So things, I tell people all the time, like some days I feel more positive than other days with data that are being released. This week, I actually feel really positive. I feel like the probability that the Fed can achieve kind of this idea of a soft landing is much higher than I originally thought it would be. Still not as high as I want it to be, but it's much higher than what I originally thought. So this, and I don't have a graph on this that was updated for this week because our data source for this got hacked, like had a ransomware attack this week, and we don't have it back yet. But this breaks down that number I just showed you. So this is month over month CPI growth, and it breaks it down by what's driving it. And we specifically pulled out some things that were impacted really heavily by COVID. And by supply chain issues and things like that. You might remember the Fed using terms like transitory inflation. That was really back there in like March, April, May, June 2021. And you can see there that used vehicle prices were driving a huge percent of inflation. And green, which is everything else, was actually negative. We were actually seeing deflation in everything else. So that was transitory. What does that mean? That means this isn't going to last, right? The market's going to adjust to this, and used car prices can change very quickly, and we have seen them come down some. But what we started seeing, and why the Fed stopped using the term transitory, Jay Powell probably wouldn't like that I'm even using it right now, is that green bar got positive and started getting bigger and bigger. So inflation became much more broad-based. In addition, that pink bar is rent. Rent is sticky. What do I mean by that? Well, I just said used car prices could change rapidly, right? They could change overnight. So could airline prices. I mean, sometimes like I could buy a ticket right now and you could buy one 2 hours later and pay a lower price in theory, right? But rents are sticky. Once your landlord sets your rent for a year, it is highly unlikely, even if prices are declining, that they come back and say, you know what, you can pay us less. That's probably not going to happen. And so the sticky prices take longer to adjust to inflation. And so it becomes more concerning when they're stickier. You'll see last month in October that that green bar was negative. It also was earlier this year. The overall core CPI was year over year was 6% at this last, in the report that came out this last week. It was 7.1 for overall, but it was 9.1 back in the summer. So this is a significant decline in the past few months. Someone asked where they can find the data on this decomposition. You can find it at the BLS. The BLS has inflation by different products. So this last time, one of the things that grew the most was the price of eggs. And it's so funny that that was the top one because I had a friend that texted me, it was at Publix, and eggs were $6.99 a dozen, and she was complaining. And then the next day I saw on CPI reports that eggs had gone up more than anything else. So you can actually see it by good. You can also see it by categories there. Somebody also asked about, did the 1.5 million immigrant comment that I make include undocumented immigrants? No, it does not. So that's legal immigrants. I will say there were also a good number of legal immigrants that left during COVID. And part of that was because many of them did not qualify for the stimulus. So if you were here on certain visas, you were not eligible to get, expanded unemployment and the stimulus checks. And so for some of those families, they had to leave. They weren't eligible to get to the support that other people got, even though they were legally here. So some people left by choice. Others, it's just we haven't replaced them, right? We haven't in the process. If you talk to employers that deal with getting people in on H-1B visas or even migrant work visas, it's been very, very difficult the past couple of years, or past not couple of years, 4 or 5 years. So I wanted to show you this dot plot, and I normally would have 2 graphs that match beautifully, but once again, that hack also impacted these. But this is what we call the dot plot. This is the estimates of what the FOMC participants, so as a reminder, the FOMC are the 7 board of governors, Jay Powell's the head of that, 7 board of governors, and then the 12 presidents of the Regional Federal Reserve Bank, including our president, Tom Barkin. They are each represented here in a dot. And they ask them, where do you think interest rates are going to be going forward? And they do this every other meeting. So June, 4 meetings ago, I just wanted to show this as a comparison. Nobody thought we would be over 4% by the end of the year. And we ended at 4.25 to 4.5. So I point this out to show you this is really dynamic, right? They're looking at data as it comes in real time and adjusting their expectations as they see the data and respond to the data, and they ended up being more aggressive than they thought they would be. Looking forward, this is a really interesting dot plot. Next year, consensus is pretty tight, right? People think they'll be, almost everybody thinks they'll be above 5% next year. But then it starts spreading out, right? And there's one of these people who believe we're going to be above 5% still for federal funds rate in 2025. That governor or president of a Fed, that we don't know who is what dot. I don't know which dot is Tom Barkin, but that person clearly believes that inflation is going to be more stubborn than some of the other people. But you can see that the dot plot spreads out. It shows how uncertain this is, right? I mean, this is not an exact science. There's art to this. And so they're taking the data they have and adjusting monetary policy to try to inflation and not cause a significant recession, right? But there's still uncertainty there. One thing I will point out to you, though, is if you go to the far right in the longer run, they all, for the most part, kind of agree, like their longer term view hasn't changed. They mostly think we'll be somewhere around 2.5% in the long run. So I do want to mention one last thing, and I'll kind of summarize it and take the last questions that are on there. Historical context is important, and I think it's important for 2 reasons here. The number one reason, and actually there's one more increase because it's got increased before after I made the slide this week, so there's been one more bump up. But number one, we are still at rates that are far below what we have seen in the past, right? And this goes back to 1980, the 82, this graph does. But 4.25% is certainly nowhere near record high federal funds rate levels. That's important. And I like to point out to people, if you look to the point, like when I was in college in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was a bubble, right? I mean, we had a bubble in our economy, the internet bubble, that we were over 5% rate at that point, and we had quite high economic growth. But it's also important that to acknowledge that for a lot of working adults, like everybody under age 40, just about, they have never seen interest rates this high. They've never seen a mortgage rate above 5%. They've never seen rates on CDs where you could save your money and get paid 3 or 4% on a 8-month CD or whatever. They've never seen anything like this. And so it makes sense that that is going to shock people a bit, right? And so these people, these young adults, are making business decisions. They're deciding whether to buy a home. They're deciding how to spend their money. They're running businesses, and they're deciding how to invest that business's money. And so I think that's important to acknowledge too, that for a large part of the population, that these rates seem very, very high. And so I'll just summarize by saying, you know, the estimates for fourth quarter growth kind of show that we're probably going to be around flat for the year, maybe up a little bit. There's still a lot of potential speed bumps. So COVID related stuff still, geopolitical issues, certainly we have been exposed to that this year. Inflation that significantly exceeds expectations, if all of a sudden it jumps up and economists aren't expecting it, that's going to be a bad situation. And I think there's a big question mark about what happens to employment. There are still a lot of employers that believe there's just going to at some point be this rush back in terms of labor supply. I don't think that's the case. I think we're going to be more of a constrained labor supply environment for the long haul. And I think companies are going to have to get more creative about how they engage with potential workers, you know, whether that's helping to subsidize childcare or not requiring the college degree that you've required in the past or things like that. And then I'll just end by saying, you know, before I do some questions, the FOMC's already raised rates considerably, but they've been very clear that they're going to do this until it's done, until they really believe that inflation is going to be back at 2%. So how high will the rates need to go to do that? I don't know. But I do trust that they're focused on, very keenly focused on the goal of getting us back to 2%. So I'll end there, and I'm going to take a few of these questions and feel free to put a few more in if you want to. So one person asked, it's very specific, but we know how much of the Rocky Mount regression can be attributed to the QVC fire and the subsequent loss of jobs? You know, I'll expand on that a little bit and just say, I don't think it's just about QVC. I think it's about a broader trend in the loss of manufacturing and some distribution jobs in more rural areas. We've seen growth in advanced manufacturing, but we're seeing it in areas like, I don't know if you guys saw, but South Carolina had the largest announcement ever, economic development announcement ever a couple days ago, but it's right outside of Charleston, right? And so it's close to one of the bigger metros, and I think that's a pattern we've been seeing where advanced manufacturing is really growing in the Charlotte metro, for example, but it's not necessarily growing in places like Rocky Mount. But certainly that is impacted. Anytime a plant closes, anytime an employer closes, it's a significant employer that's going to make a difference. Another question, North Carolina is one of the states where there is higher incoming population. Do you see a relationship with employment increases to industries like professional services? Absolutely. We've seen a lot of immigration in North and South Carolina, and when people move in, they need to be served, right? And they need doctors, and they need lawyers, and they need dry cleaners, and they need everything, all those services. And so certainly there's a demand for more employment, and that's likely to continue. We are really lucky that we're a state with immigration because we are not facing the economic difficulties that some other places are facing as a state overall, which means we have healthy budgets, right, statewide. We have healthy tax revenues, but it doesn't mean that labor is not challenging and that it won't be challenging going forward. And then the last one on here says, considering there's been a significant decline in government jobs and local state government employees could achieve full retirement at 55, is that part of the issue? Is that they're choosing to retire at 55 instead of working beyond 30 years because they were fed up with circumstances, teachers, for example? I mean, this is a non-mathematical answer, but yes, I think so. Like, this gets back to the point I made about people leaving jobs that are really hard, that aren't paid all that well. If you're in a job like being a K through 12 teacher that got very difficult before and during COVID, and after COVID, I've talked to teachers who are having horrific attendance problems and things like that still. You know, my best friend is a first grade teacher, and she talks about how kids in her class still can't hold a pencil correctly because they were out of, you know, they didn't have normal pre-K. You look at high schoolers, their achievement in many places is way off from where it would normally be. So that job is really, really hard. It's not paid all that great. And I could just walk away and still get a pension check every week and keep my benefits. That sounds pretty good, right? So I think you've definitely seen people that have the ability to retire go ahead and do it. And some of them are choosing to retire from that profession, but then go get another job doing something else, right? And I know personally many teachers who have left to go do jobs in professional business services. And so I think that is that teachers have great skills, right? They're great communicators, they're great negotiators. They're probably really good at sales, a lot of them, I bet. So it's not like they can't go find employment elsewhere. And so that's a conversation about, with teaching, I think, but other things too. Why are people leaving these jobs and what can we do about it? The story is partially about wages, but it's not all about wages. It's other things too. One last question. Somebody said, any feel for how many people have 2+ jobs? This is a great question. This is hard for us to tell exactly in the data. We will get more specific data eventually where we can tell better, some survey data, but in the current employment data, it's difficult to see. However, based on some data patterns that we're seeing, we do believe more people have picked up second jobs recently. You have the employer survey and the household survey. The household survey just counts one person, like you're employed or not. The business survey, the establishment survey, is counting how many jobs are at each establishment. That establishment survey number has been higher than the household survey number. And one reason that could be is that people are picking up other jobs. I think that makes sense with inflation. So I think that's the case. So I'll stop there since I'm 1 minute over, I think, Trey.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Laura. That worked out perfectly. And I was joking with you before the presentation. Some of this information to me was a little wacky because of COVID and some of the issues.
Yeah.
Now, after listening to your presentation, it's a bit wackier because you don't even have, it's not just the supply chain issues from COVID and some of the demand issues and economic issues created from COVID and recovery of that. But now you have the social and behavioral issues you said, with teachers and students being far behind, and some of the modern men and the issues they're having. I've got a boys and men on my Christmas list now.
Yeah, good.
But those will kind of have an effect going into the future. And so it's a lot of relevant information for Eastern North Carolina, some of the stuff we do. But thank you so much. I'm sure others share the sentiment that we could do this for a couple more hours, or maybe we could do this quarterly or even monthly, because it is so dynamic and it changes so quickly. But thank you so much. I won't take any more of y'all's time. I know you're very busy. This is a recorded session, so I will send it out in an updated email with the slides and some other information mentioned from Laura. Maybe she'll have some other things she wants me to add. Reach out to me if you have any questions, but thank you guys so much. Happy holidays. Have a good one.
Yeah, thanks. Happy holidays, everybody.